What's a fact that sounds like a conspiracy theory but is actually true? Story 1. Back in the 80s, in an effort to crack down on homosexuals within their ranks, the US Navy spent millions of dollars to investigate a woman known only as Dorothy, because undercover agents discovered that many suspected gay men all referenced this name, so they believed she might have been a madame who organized gay meetings, and finding her could help them ID lots of gay men. After several years and millions of dollars of investigation, they determined that questions like, "Are you friends with Dorothy?" was a means of gay men identifying to each other without outing themselves in public. Dorothy never existed. Story 2. In 1994, the United States Air Force attempted to make a non-lethal weapon that was supposed to turn you gay. It was formally called the gay bomb, and their idea was that the bomb would contain human sexual pheromone, which would release whenever the bomb would be dropped. Whoever would smell, be affected by the pheromones would theoretically turn gay, and the USAF hoped that once the men turned gay, they would be too infatuated by each other to fight, letting America win future wars. Obviously, this was never made, but only because they couldn't get it to work. It did win a satirical Nobel Peace Prize. Story 3. In the 1950s and 1960s, the US Army sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide ZNCS in St. Louis as part of a Cold War-era military experiment to test how biological warfare agents might spread in different environments. The Army sprayed the inorganic compound, which glows bright yellow under ultraviolet light, in 20 residential areas, 13 downtown locations, and 2 5-square-mile sections of the city. The Army used a variety of methods to spray the chemical, including blowers on top of buildings, from the backs of station wagons, and via planes. The Army also sprayed the chemical during Operation Al-Asik in 1957 and 1958, which involved dispersing large amounts of ZNCs across the United States. Story 4. Whoever holds the office of President of Portugal is the leader of the Knights Templar, or the closest thing to it. When the Templars were excommunicated by the Pope and many sentenced to death, the King of Portugal at the time, Denis, gave the Templars refuge in Portugal, in part for their role in conquering lands as Portugal expanded southward in Iberia. He delayed trying them and eventually created a new Ordem de Cristo that took in Templars as members. Portugal, and not the Church, got to keep control of the group's money and lands. Eventually, the Ordem de Cristo became a symbolic and military club, and the position of leader to this day is the President of Portugal. Story 5. Sugar-free gum can actually help prevent cavities. Chewing sugar-free gum increases saliva production, which helps neutralize acids produced by bacteria in the mouth, wash away food particles, and strengthen tooth enamel through the delivery of minerals like calcium and phosphate. Xylitol, a natural sugar alcohol used as a sweetener in sugar-free gum, can actually help prevent cavities. Unlike regular sugar, xylitol is not fermented by oral bacteria, which means it does not produce the acids that lead to tooth decay. In fact, xylitol can inhibit the growth of cavity-causing bacteria, Streptococcus mutans, by reducing their ability to stick to the teeth and reducing their overall presence in the mouth. This makes xylitol-containing gum not only a safer alternative to sugar-sweetened gum, but also an active player in maintaining oral health. Drilling a cavity does not eliminate the bacteria that cause cavities. It merely addresses the structural damage. Story 6. Up until very recently, one company, De Beers, sold nearly all of the diamonds in the world. To this day, however, they still control like 2/3 of the world's diamond trade. They restrict supply to keep prices high, and are the reason diamond engagement rings are a thing in the first place. They happened occasionally, but just weren't the standard until De Beers created an ad campaign. By the way, they also are the origin for the expected pricing. The idea that it should be a certain portion of your salary came from them. Originally 1 month, but it crept up further and further. Diamonds aren't nearly as valuable as you think they are. Sandpaper usually has some diamond dust on it, and synthetic diamonds are surprisingly cheap to make. Meanwhile, restricted supply and cartel behavior has kept the price of things like diamond rings far higher than it should be. They're also the reason people care about the distinction between a natural diamond and a synthetic one, even though it's extremely unlikely you'd actually be able to tell the difference. Story 7. In the 1970s, neocons including Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz set up a group called Team B, to prove their belief that the Soviet Union was zooming ahead in the arms race, despite all intelligence from the CIA's Team A stating the opposite. When they found literally no evidence, they concluded that this meant the Soviets were so sophisticated they could hide all of their new weapons. They said that the US submarine fleet was threatened by a new non-acoustic Soviet listening technology, and that the total lack of evidence it existed was proof it existed. All of this non-evidence was published by the Committee for the Present Danger. Story 8. In 2016, Hillary Clinton had a deal with the Democratic National Committee, headed by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who was her co-campaign chair before becoming DNC chair, where wealthy donors could make one contribution to her campaign, the DNC, and the state parties, in one check. This was called bundling, which makes it easy to Google this to verify. The way it worked is you'd write a huge check, and the maximum allowed contribution would go to Hillary, the maximum contribution would go to the DNC, and anything left over would go to participating state parties. Sounds elite but legit, right? Problem is, 99.5% of the money that was supposed to go to the state parties, to elect down-ballot candidates, was instead returned to the DNC, which spent it on ads indistinguishable from Hillary's, except they didn't have to have the "I'm Hillary Clinton and I approve this message" part. And who was DNC chair before Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and stepped down so DWS, Hillary's friend, could become chair? That would be Tim Kaine, who would later, somehow, coincidentally, be the one Hillary chose as a running mate. Story 9. Here's my all-time favorite. There's a direct causal link between Nazism and current management doctrines. New public management. In fact, the #1 reconversion for high-ranking Nazi lawmakers able to escape justice was teachers or directors in private business schools, and they went on to heavily influence what are now widely implemented management policies. Most famously, the expression "human resources" comes straight from the Third Reich edit. I initially said "fourth" like an idiot. Previous similar terms were created in Britain and France, but they were very niche, and nobody in their right mind would have called humans resources. Now here's a cute one. The first instances of a happiness manager on the workplace have been in, Nazi Germany. And there's zero ambiguity on this one's origin. It absolutely sounds like an unhinged leftist pothead theory, and yet that's solid and sourced knowledge many historians worked on. Story 10. Several companies made billions of dollars off every war in the last 120 years. Lobbyists for big businesses use nearly unlimited budgets to influence congressional decisions. Social media companies base their algorithms around maximizing user engagement at the expense of truth and safety, and actively suppress any internal movement toward any reforms to increase safety and truth, because that would decrease engagement. Most of the mainstream news sources are owned by a handful of extremely rich people, with agendas that often coincide with that of Claude Schwab. You will own nothing and you will be happy. Everyone should eat bugs. Story 11. Nixon ended the war in Vietnam against the wishes of the U.S. military and intelligence community. Bob Woodward was a naval intelligence officer before starting at the Washington Post. Watergate was his first big story. 5 of the 6 Watergate break-in suspects were affiliated with the CIA. Deep Throat was the deputy director of the FBI. The president who took over from Nixon was a member of the Warren Commission, and the only U.S. president to never be elected as president or VP. Watergate was literally a military coup. Update: Nixon was also the most popular president in history, winning 49 states in his 1972 re-election, the biggest electoral college victory ever. Story 12. Our system of financing public works using bonds is an engine that, on average, transfers money from everyone to the rich. Local and state governments and even the federal government issue bonds to finance things when there isn't the political will to finance those same things using taxes. The problem is that the only people and entities with the money to buy such bonds are banks, institutional and corporate investors, and rich people, mostly operating through institutional and corporate investors. Those bonds incur interest, so the buyers end up paid back with more money than they spent. Meanwhile, bonds are paid back using taxes and other local government revenue, which the rich are disproportionately spared. Sales taxes, citations, and various other local taxes are regressive rather than progressive, meaning the poor tend to pay a larger proportion of their income to these taxes and citations than the rich. On the whole, this means that financing things with bonds transfers money from everyone else to the investment class. Those who have money to invest are invariably rich, And this engine that transfers money from everyone to the rich is widespread. Every local government that finances projects using bonds participates in this rich person enriching system. Story 13. The CIA performed illegal testing on people trying to see if they could create telekinetic psychic beings to use. They used psychedelics to try and achieve this. They did this in like the 60s and 70s. Project MKUltra is a movie based on that experiment and the name of the illegal experiment. The possible conspiracy theory part is that they outlawed psychedelics because they found that it made people question authority. They didn't like that. Hippies protested using drugs because they found out what the government was doing, and that was their rebellion, to use drugs freely. The government branded them as hippies and got everyone to despise them and forget all about the horrors they were putting people through. One more conspiracy theory part. Stranger Things tells one of the possibilities of those experiments from a fictional standpoint. 11 and all those other kids could have been based on real PPL. The Upside Down could have been a world they found themselves crossing into. Story 14. I'm still absolutely baffled that the general public doesn't know about the scope and scale of the Iran-Contra scandal. You can literally watch videos of Reagan and Oliver North testifying in Congress that they were involved in CIA operations, smuggling drugs into the United States in order to raise money to arm the Nicaraguan Contras. They tap dance around their involvement by justifying the action by stating that in their opinion, it was necessary. The reality is that anyone who does some research on this scandal ends up having their mind blown. It used to take a solid month of research to really go down the rabbit hole, but as of 2024, the only thing someone has to do is watch the series The Octopus Murders on Netflix. It will seriously blow your mind and whet your appetite. Story 15. The first phase of the New Deal was actually modeled on Mussolini's fascist guild state. The architect of the first New Deal was General Johnson, an avowed fascist who spent years sending letters to congressmen urging them to overthrow Hoover and seize power. When FDR won, Bernard Baruch paid the Democratic Party $50,000 to add Johnson to FDR's brain trust. When he joined, he quickly handed out books on the fascist guild model and developed an exact copy of the fascist system. It was sent to Congress and passed in the National Industrial Recovery Act. Johnson established the guilds as the National Recovery Administration and called them code authorities. These authorities forced all workers to join state-sanctioned unions. In order to control the workers, companies would make their own unions and get approval by the government to be the only sanctioned union that could represent workers. This resulted in independent unions essentially getting outlawed. Johnson also wanted control over the WPA, but FDR refused to give it to him largely because Perkins warned FDR that Johnson seemed to be trying to amass power. In 1935, Johnson is fired, and the code authorities are ruled unconstitutional. Within a few months, General Smedley Butler comes forward claiming that businessmen came to him to see if he would lead a military coup to oust FDR. Butler claimed they told him that Johnson was supposed to force FDR to delegate his emergency powers to Johnson and then force FDR into semi-retirement. This would leave Johnson with total dictatorial control over the government, and the code authorities allowed him to pass laws without Congress. This plan fell apart because the Supreme Court ruled that code authorities didn't have the power to pass their own laws. Only Congress had that power. So Johnson getting fired, and the Supreme Court decision prevented this first coup from taking place. The second coup was the Butler coup. The businessmen brought Butler to a hotel and handed him several thousands of dollars to lead a military coup. They told him that the American Liberty League, an anti-FDR organization made up of rich conservative Democrats, was funding the American Legion and preparing them for a coup. They wanted to make Butler the leader of the American Legion. The Legionnaires for years bragged openly about being supporters of fascism and called themselves the American version of Mussolini's black shirts. Butler had known this and was aware they were an anti-democratic organization. He refused to have any role and reported this to a congressional investigation. The investigation proved that these conversations took place. They found the deposit slips showing how much money they pulled out to give to Butler and then deposited back in when he refused the money. They also found the letters between the plotters, but they couldn't prove that a real coup was in development and that all of these groups and wealthy businessmen were involved.